Welcome, everyone. It took me 23 years to write the book that you see on the screen. I had to overcome a number of obstacles, particularly the biggest hurdle facing when you do something like this is challenging the establishment, challenging orthodoxy in terms of who the author was. I learned in middle school that the guy from Stratford signed his name 6 different ways as Shakespeare, and that even in the Folger paperback editions, they said there was no connection between this greatest writer in the English language and the works in the Shakespeare plays. Do you know that there's no record that Shakespeare of Stratford ever attended the country school in town, but you do have to pay admission to see it. And there are many claims that he went there. He did own 10% of the Globe Theatre when he died, so he was a wonderful businessman. But unlike the man from Stratford, I knew that I was always a writer, and I have juvenilia writings to prove it. I could see no connection between the man from Stratford and the Shakespeare plays, along with many others. I had to do a lot of research. When you go against the establishment of Shakespeare, they think that you're a man or a woman who should wear a tinfoil hat because either you're some kind of nutcase lunatic or an ethereal snob who thinks that you have to know what you're doing in order to do it. The actual man from Oxford, Earl of Oxford, who wrote the plays, was introduced to me by David Lloyd Krieger, who stood behind me in terms of my writing this book about the Oxfordian authorship. He passed away in 1990, but he introduced me to the 17th Earl of Oxford, Edward de Vere, who lived between 1550 and 1604. He had the education, he was part of the court, he was Queen Elizabeth's favorite courtier, so he had a lot of connections, and he was a known writer. You see before you his birthplace in Castle Hedingham in England. This is Hedingham Castle, which is located in Castle Hedingham. We have the Earl of Oxford's written writings from when he was a child. He was a known writer and translator. Before you, you see the hall, the great hall for banqueting, and you can see it's 2 levels. There's a minstrel gallery, and there's a place where people would eat. His father, Lord John, 16th Earl of Oxford, had players that he supported. Before you now, you see the Earl of Oxford carrying the sword of state. He was the Lord Great Chamberlain of England, and beside him is Queen Elizabeth. I love the way he's holding it. It's kind of suggestive. He had that kind of sense of humor, which you do see in the Shakespeare plays. Before you, you see Hamlet. There are a lot of events from the Earl of Oxford's life that go along with Hamlet. The sudden death of his father. He's an adolescent at 12 and thinks maybe there was some murder most foul going on. Before you, you all know Queen Elizabeth I, who supported the writing of Shakespeare. The first known work is Venus and Adonis with the word Shakespeare hyphenated. And it was said that the Earl of Oxford was a champion jouster. This is his father-in-law, who didn't like the idea that Oxford was also known, that it was said that his countenance shook spears. Shakes spears was the word they used at the time as a jouster. This is Lord Burleigh. You've just seen his slide. This is his young daughter, Anne, who marries the Earl of Oxford. She's a very timid person, and you can see by the look on her face, this was a very serious person who, in the sequel that I'm writing, is based on her life events. And it's a really tragic life of being played, in a way. This is Sir Derek Jacobi, who, as you can probably read from the slide, he is a proponent of the fact that it wasn't the man from Stratford. This is Sir Mark Rylance, who was also another person, and as you can see, these men are not wearing any tinfoil hats at all. But they understand that the passion, the feelings, and so forth, and the experience has to be there in the writer, and this kind of genius work doesn't just spring out of the ether. Sigmund Freud was a proponent of the Earl of Oxford as the author of the plays. This is the father of psychoanalysis, who understood the connection between human behavior and what is demonstrated in what you know as what you do. You might recognize these people here. What happens when you overcome your doubts about whether you can write a book is you have book signings, and people like this show up. These are my good friends who are connected through Thornton Friends and Sandy Spring. So what you have to know in conclusion is that in challenging the establishment, you have to speak your truth to power by means of writing, and you're subject to all kinds of criticism. But you have to know that you can do it, because there's people like Peter, and thankfully in my life, who helped me to understand that you must know in the wellspring of your heart that you can do it. And Peter was my cheerleader. This book would not exist without his presence in my life. So you need a cheerleader, and you need to believe. Thank you.